Hey everyone, this video is intended to help you understand the rhetorical appeals a bit more. And this is what the rhetorical triangle consists of. So we have the appeals, logos, pathos, and ethos with their definitions out from them. And then within the middle of the triangle, we have the other things you should be considering when it comes to analyzing rhetoric. So what I'm going to do is just go over this handout with you guys, and then we're going to look at some examples of these appeals in an article. So let's start with logos. Logos is the Greek term for logic, but it has been made to represent facts, research, and other message elements that provide proof or evidence that what the audience is hearing or seeing is factual and supported. Specifically, when we think of logos, we want to think of anything in the text that is working to support the overall argument. Anything that is functioning as evidence to prove the argument true that will make the audience believe the argument. That means that if you see a statistic or something like that in your article, a lot of students just automatically assume that's a good example of logos, but that's not always the case. You can use statistics for lots of things. For example, a lot of articles will have statistics in the introduction just to give you background information. That information in the introduction is not working to support the argument within the article. So you want to think of logos as proof, evidence, or support. Okay, so anything that is functioning as that. That can appear as logic, statistics, secondary sources, opinions, explanations, examples, and so on. So there are lots of different forms of evidence. So that's what logos is. We'll move on to pathos, which is a lot of times the easiest one to understand, maybe the hardest one to identify though. Pathos is the Greek term for emotion, but it has been made to represent how an audience feels or experiences a message. The appeal of pathos makes a person feel excited, sad, angry, motivated, jealous, or any number of emotions that may persuade them to act based on what the communicator says. When you're looking at pathos or you're trying to find pathos in your articles, it's not always going to be emotional language necessarily or emotional writing that's pathos. You need to think about the intended audience and how they would react to certain things that the author says. That means that you're going to have to take your audience's values into consideration, what they care about, and what they think about the overall topic, and think about how that intended audience would react to certain statements in the article. And then once you figure that out, once you find something that the audience might react to emotionally, to analyze pathos, you need to make sure you identify a specific emotion and explain why they would feel that way. And most importantly, how that feeling, that emotion, the audience feeling that emotion is contributing to the purpose of the article. Why did the author want the audience to feel that way? How is that achieving the purpose or getting them to believe the overall argument in the article? Okay, moving on to ethos. Ethos is the Greek term for ethics, but has been made to represent the trustworthiness of the text and the credibility of the person communicating. Ethos is established through a variety of factors, including status, awareness, professionalism, education, celebrity endorsement, secondary research, and so forth. Ethos establishes trust between the audience and communicator. The most common error we see with ethos is that because it means ethics, students automatically assume that anytime you see a moral or ethical argument, that is ethos. That's not true. So let's just try to not think of ethos as ethics. Let's just think of ethos as credibility and trustworthiness. So it's whatever is making the audience trust what the author is saying, whether that's the author's credentials, their degree. So that would be extrinsic ethos. It's outside of the text. So the qualifications of the author, the publication where the article is printed, if that is a really reputable, true publication, then it's going to have better ethos. And then we could also look at the vocabulary within the article. Does the author seem educated? Does the author seem to have researched the topic thoroughly? Those are other things that would make us trust what the author is saying, and that would be intrinsic ethos, and that means that it's inside of the text. So we have two different types of ethos: extrinsic, outside, factors we consider outside of the writing, and then intrinsic, factors that we would consider inside of the writing. The other things that I want to talk to you about are the audience, the purpose, and the context. So these three things are what you're going to have to consider before you even look at the rhetorical appeals. So I mentioned audience earlier. To analyze the rhetorical appeals, we obviously have to consider the audience, the intended audience. Everyone has an intended audience in mind, every author, every writer, every speaker. And that's because it's almost impossible to reach every single person in the same way. And so everyone has an idea of an intended audience, whether that's their education level, the values that they have, their gender, and so on. We need to try to identify the intended audience of each article. So I'm just going to read what I have here. It's important to identify the communicator's intended audience, since those people will determine the content of and approach the communicator takes to the message. Consider the publication, the level of writing, the emotional appeal, and any other factors to determine the audience of a text. We have to determine the intended audience because that's how we're going to be analyzing the rhetorical appeals. If it's going to have an emotional effect on the audience, it can't be you yourself necessarily, you reading it, because you may not be a member of the intended audience, the audience that the author had in mind as he or she was writing the article. And so we want to think about how the intended audience would react and analyze it according to that. Next is the purpose. We obviously have to identify the purpose in each article because we're analyzing how well the authors achieve that purpose, how successful they are at persuading their audience. Understanding a writer's purposes can help you understand one of the most important aspects of the rhetorical situation. Among other factors, identifying a writer's purposes can help you understand the writer's decisions about the content, structure, and design of a document. Often the purpose is to get the audience to believe the overall message or to motivate them to perform an action based on the message. That's pretty straightforward, so we'll move on to context. For writers, context shapes, some might argue that it actually causes the purpose for writing. So context is anything surrounding the argument or the text. So anything that causes authors to write the article, anything that affects the way they write the article. So audience would actually be considered part of the context. Moreover, context affects the opportunities, requirements, and limitations that affect the choices writers make as they compose their documents. For readers, context shapes their attempt to construct meaning as they read. Physical context can enhance or diminish their ability to read the document. Social context can affect the extent to which writers and readers share common experiences and expectations about a text. Cultural context will affect the fundamental assumptions, beliefs, and aspirations that they bring to the reading of a text. Really, a lot of what context consists of is audience, but there are other factors as well, such as the publication. Why did that publication publish that article? How does that affect the reading, the audience's perception of the article? The time period is part of the context as well. So there are a lot of different factors, and those are all things we need to consider. So when we're rhetorically analyzing an article, we need to think about the intentions of the author. So we'll move on and look at an article and identify some stuff in here. I've just grabbed this article from NPR. It's called "The Necessity of Animal Research Does Not Mean It's Ethical." Rather than reading this entire thing with you guys, what I've done is I've highlighted the thesis statement. So I'll jump down here to the thesis statement. Such advances, medical advances, this author means Samuel Garner. Such advances are undoubtedly of significant moral importance. But even if we grant the assumption that animals are necessary for medical progress, this does not equate to a moral justification. So what this author is saying is that while animals have contributed to the advancements in science, or medical advancements specifically, just because that's happened does not mean that animal testing and animal research is moral or ethical. So that's the overall argument. So some other things that I've done in here is I've just highlighted one example of each of the rhetorical appeals. First one I have here is pathos. So a lot of this article is written in very scientific language. It's very kind of cut and dry, and there's not a lot of emotion in here. There's also not a lot of, so animal testing, the topic, gives you the opportunity to be kind of graphic in what you're saying, but this sentence here is really the only time that this author gets any sort of emotional. And I wouldn't even say that the author gets emotional here. I would just say that he's explaining it in a way to create an emotion in the audience. So I'll read this. Most animals involved in research are killed at the termination of the experiment, are kept in conditions not conducive to their welfare, and are otherwise harmed in myriad insignificant ways. For example, through the infliction of physical injuries, infectious diseases, cancers, or psychological distress. So what this is doing is it's making us feel sympathy for the animals that are being researched. So if we feel that sympathy, then we're going to feel a moral obligation to those animals. So sympathy here is the emotion that we would identify as we're analyzing this article. Sympathy is going to get us to understand or come to the realization that maybe animal testing is not as moral as we thought it was, and therefore that is getting us to believe the overall argument that just because animal research has contributed to medical advancements, it does not mean it's moral. So that's the connection there. This is an example of logos. So this article specifically doesn't have a lot of sources cited and doesn't have a lot of statistics in here. But what a lot of online articles do is they just provide links to other articles, and that's kind of their way of citing other research. So they're like, here you go. If you want to read more about this, then click on this link, and that will give you more proof of what I'm saying. This is in a way to give evidence in, this time period where we're using the internet and everything, and a ton of information is available to us. All right, so I'm going to read this example of logos. Despite strong claims about the historical benefits of animal research from the scientific community, the accuracy of animal models in predicting human responses has not been evaluated sufficiently, and the lack of certain kinds of data make this evaluation especially challenging. Based on existing data, however, numerous reviews have suggested that the accuracy of animal research in predicting human health outcomes appears to be far less than what we once assumed. This is proof that animal research is not necessarily the best way to go about things. This claim is backed up by this link here, which includes statistics about the fact that animal research is not that effective. So that is a good example of logos there. Moving on to ethos. So I have two examples of ethos here. So this one is extrinsic ethos. That means it's outside of the actual writing of the article. So this is just Samuel Garner's credentials. He's a bioethicist living in Washington, D.C. He's an associate fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics and writes on human research ethics and animal ethics. So if he's a bioethicist, then that means that he's well educated. He likely has his doctorate. However, we do know that his opinions are not totally unbiased. It's clear that he works toward getting rid of animal research, and so his opinions are going to be slightly biased, but because he's a very educated individual, we could still say that he does have some ethos there. We could say it's iffy. Depends on how you want to analyze it. So that's extrinsic ethos. Some intrinsic ethos is here. As a field that is dedicated to rigorous inquiry and rational thought, the scientific community should take seriously the vast philosophy literature on these topics. The same field that gave rise to the conceptual foundations of science, rather than assertions and rhetoric. When it comes to animals and ethics, there have been very few serious attempts to engage the intellectual issues. So here he's kind of challenging other scientists and their lack of consideration when it comes to this topic of animal research. And by doing that, he's implying that he has thought about it. He's considered all the factors, and he has considered the intellectual issues when it comes to animal testing. And so what that is doing is it's making the audience trust him more, because he's implying that he has more of an open mind, and other scientists lack that, and they have kind of a one way of thinking which is just medical advancement, and that's it. And they're not considering all of the factors, and he is. And so because he's saying that he is, we might be more likely to trust him.